we should just all get on with moving to digital sources of information. Um, in your community, what are the barriers to digitalization from your readership? Are they able to use online as freely and as effectively as uh, my grandchildren?
Senator, I'm publishing for 64 years in Canada. Canada and the United States. And I never before had any problem, and I don't have even today with my publications. If I can put out 1,000,000 copies, they will go. But the problem is that the million copies needs money. And the, from the other side, we lost advertisement, private advertisement. Every day we are losing. So therefore, we cannot do anything. Eventually, I mean, the last 2 years, 67 to 80 publications from different languages, they shut down. Some of them moved to online, but online it's only for a very small number of people that are going to work through computer and so on. The immigrant who comes tomorrow to Canada doesn't have access to online, and he or she is going always to look to get a paper, a hard copy to her hands to get the news. This is exactly the problem, and this is whatever I'm trying to communicate with you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mohammed, Ms. Deveau, Ms. Lozon, Mr. Saras. Very much appreciate your time with us here today. We will suspend for a couple of minutes to change panels. We're now resuming our meeting in public to continue our examination of Bill C-18, the Online News Act. For our second panel, we're pleased to welcome the Western Standard Derek Fildebrandt, publisher, president, CEO. From Alberta Weekly Newspaper Association, Evan Jameson, president, who's joining us by video conference. Dennis Morel, executive director by video conference. And the Coalition of Canadian Magazines, la Coalition de Magasins du Canada, Nicolas Lapierre.
We have Nicolas Lapierre, who is a member of the Association des éditeurs de magazines québécois.
No, Nicole Doucette, consultant, who's joining us. So sorry, I had my notes a bit mixed up. So thank you, and welcome to the panelists. Each organization will have 5 minutes for opening statements, and then we will turn it to questions and answers. And we will start with Western Standard. So, Mr. Fildebrandt, you have the floor.
Honorable Senators, thank you, merci, for inviting me to testify before your committee today concerning Bill C-18, the Online News Act. I come before you today representing Western Standard New Media Corporation, which includes a growing body of regional publications, including the revived Alberta Report. We are a publication highly unlike the large corporate media that have lobbied for this bill. As a so-called qualified Canadian journalism organization, we are eligible to receive the full suite of taxpayer subsidies that media are now entitled to in Canada, but we refuse to accept them. We believe that for media to be independent, we must be independent of the state. While the legacy media in Canada cry poor and claim that they're unable to make ends meet in the challenging environment of our industry, we have thrived. We have gone from a small group around my dining room table in 2019 to the most read online publication in Alberta. We have a large newsroom in our Calgary headquarters, bustling with activity and breaking original stories every day. We have bureaus in Vancouver, Edmonton, Regina, and Ottawa. And we did it all without the help of the government. I'm here today to plead with you to help stop the government from forcing its help on us through C-18. One of the most critical ways in which we were able to grow so quickly was the availability of platforms like Facebook to deliver our content to potential readers at no cost. Facebook made it possible for startups like ours to get our products in front of potential customers without the need for large, costly delivery operations. My first job was as a small town paper boy. In the winter, I even delivered papers to a makeshift dog sled with my husky. The local paper paid me to deliver their product to their customers. In 2023, Facebook is the new paper boy, albeit a very rich one. They deliver our products to our customers, but they do it for free. But greedy newspaper executives, not content with the existing massive bailout of their failing businesses, have come cap in hand to the government for even more. What they got was Bill C-18, which would force Facebook and Google to pay them for their content, for delivering their content to their customers. If the government had passed a law in 1995 requiring paper boys to pay the local paper for the privilege of delivering their products, I obviously would have quit. It should come as no surprise then that that is what today's paper boys, Facebook and Google, have promised to do. Of course, they will not pay the legacy media for helping the legacy media. It's asinine. There will be no free money from these tech giants. They'll simply turn off the news in Canada. And independent media in Canada will be collateral damage for their greed. We never asked for this bill, and we were never consulted in it. But we will have a massive source of our traffic turned off as Facebook and Google retaliate for this naked rent-seeking operation. Bill C-18 should be killed, but I understand that the Senate generally prefers to amend legislation rather than defeat it. So here's my ask. Please amend the bill to ensure that those of us not trying to grift our way to profitability are not collateral damage. Please amend the bill to make it explicitly opt-in so that only media that want to partake in this shakedown are included. Importantly, this includes removing or amending Section 51, which prohibits Facebook or Google from treating news media outlets differently. This is important because these platforms should not be required to shut down content from media outlets like the Western Standard that are not trying to fleece them. Let Goliath fight with Goliath, but do not require that the Davids here get caught in the crossfire of their squabble. One of the most important principles of our common law is that the government cannot force two unwilling parties to enter into contract with one another against their will. But that is precisely what Bill C-18 attempts to do. A free press must be free to enter into its own contracts of its own free will. And government's only role whatsoever must be in upholding those contracts in court. More subsidies, direct and indirect, from taxpayers or other industries will not save the legacy media. Competition, adaptability, and innovation will, if anything can. All these lifelines thrown to big media do is to stifle the ability of startup new media to compete. Parliament has no place in regulating the media. The state has no place in the newsrooms of the nation. I thank you for taking the time to hear me out, and I beg of you, let the remaining free press remain free. And please, for the love of God, stop trying to help us.
Thank you, Mr. Fildebrandt. And now I turn it over to Alberta Weekly Newspaper Association.
Hello, I'm Evan Jameson. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee today. I'm president of the Alberta Weekly Newspapers Association. I'm also the third generation of my family within the newspaper business, and the third generation of my family to sit as the president of our local association. Our association represents all but a few of the community papers in Alberta. Today, we've come to advocate on behalf of those businesses, considered by many to be an important part of the communities they serve. The patches of C-18 is important to the media landscape in Canada and can help shore up declining revenues at many newspapers, especially the larger ones. There is, however, significant concern amongst our membership regarding the level of support it will deliver to smaller publishers. We have heard encouraging reports out of Australia regarding deals signed by publishers of all sizes. However, there's a lot of secrecy around those deals and the level of support being provided to any given news outlet. We have seen different estimates regarding the level of funding that could come from C-18 and where most of those funds will end up. Considering those estimates and the nature of the value exchange calculation between publishers and platforms, it appears the revenue to small and medium-sized outlets could be very low. We are also concerned the major platforms will try to reduce the value of these deals, as similar legislation is considered in different jurisdictions. Many different countries are looking at this, and the cost of all those agreements will accumulate amongst the platforms. It appears to many that Meta has avoided new deals with news outlets. They've also stated they will stop hosting content if C-18 is passed in its current form. The move would significantly reduce the level of funding coming through C-18 and impact traffic to many news sites. Google has stated that their news showcase is not a fit for small and medium-sized publishers. Google and Meta state that they gain little revenue directly from news. However, there's a strong argument that news does add value to both their platforms, even if it's not direct. More time on sites, more data collected from users, etc. We must also keep in mind that the digital world and platforms are constantly evolving. It is difficult to say which platforms and technology will be dominant into the future. Governments and private lawsuits around the world are challenging the major platforms that have concern for anti-competitive practices, privacy, and misinformation. How will recent and ongoing developments in generative artificial intelligence impact this bill and the news operation it supports? It's a very quickly moving field. We are encouraged to see amendments to the bill allowing non-arm's length owner-operators to qualify. There are many of these small operations across Canada, and they are often the only source of news in the communities they serve. We are also very concerned about the timelines projected by the CRTC, upwards of 2 years to have regulations in place to facilitate arbitration. This is far too long given the precarious state of our industry. As it's been pointed out in previous hearings, there is no single solution to support all news outlets. The business models and scale at which they operate vary greatly. It is a very diverse industry serving many different types of communities. What may work at a national scale with broad audience will not necessarily work in a small town with a limited pool of interested readers. The situation is dire for many news outlets. Some would blame this on an inability to adapt. Too often we get described as legacy or dinosaurs, married to the old way of doing things. This isn't the case. Many operators are experimenting with different business and distribution models. Newspapers have long been early adopters of technology. The problem is that there isn't a clear path to success, especially for smaller local publishers. Good journalism takes time, is expensive to produce, and ephemeral in nature. While there are some encouraging signs that new models are evolving, it is too early to know their longevity and what types of communities will be able to support them. We often hear about the latest and greatest new model, only to have them fail after a period of time. They can also vary greatly in their quality and type of news they produce. Simply regurgitating news releases isn't enough. We must rebuild and strengthen news outlets that have been decimated by many years of revenue decline. We need not only to preserve what exists, but find adequate resources to provide quality news and information to local communities, not just for existing players, but new ones as well, in digital or printed form. We support C-18, but think more is needed. Through the continued expansion of existing proven programs, in addition to others, the government has long supported local media through aid to publishers and more recently through special measures for journalism. The local journalism initiative has been very important for many of our members serving small rural communities and underserved communities in general. But that program is not necessarily set to go on permanently. Perhaps other funding methods such as a refundable subscription tax credit could be a real benefit for small weekly newspapers, helping to restore subscription revenues that have steadily drained away over the past 10 to 15 years. Today's non-refundable digital news subscription tax credit primarily benefits Canada's large metropolitan daily newspapers. Other things that have been brought up would be, perhaps a tax on digital advertising sold in the Canadian market that could be redistributed through a fund to Canadian news outlets. Advertising has long supported journalism. We're working with Canada Post to improve delivery timelines and reduce costs, especially for rural areas. Canada Post has also become a significant competitor for flyer distribution. Perhaps they should be required to support local journalism and become part of the solution rather than the problem. As has been echoed by many other witnesses and members of this community, we fundamentally believe that quality news coverage, however it is served, is vitally important to all communities, and we are encouraged that the federal government is working on ways to support our industry in a great time of need. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jameson. Now I will turn it over to the Coalition of Canadian Magazines, Monsieur Lapierre et Madame Doucet.
Bonjour. Alors, je veux d'abord
Hello, and thank you so much for inviting us here today to give us this opportunity of sharing our values with you. In a country like ours, from the Pacific to the Atlantic, where there is great diversity, we have to be who we are. We have to conserve the wealth of our uniqueness and our identities. We want to allow Canadians from diversities to survive throughout the regions in Canada. And I'm going to get into the subject of magazines, but I know that there have been some moments of bias with respect to magazines. That is to say, some people think that magazines are just for women and they're not very serious. But I can tell you that they are part of our coalition. We have the Association québécoise des éditeurs des magazines, and from Alberta, we have the Alberta Magazine Publishers Association, and from BC, the Magazine Canada from BC, and also the umbrella organization representing magazines throughout Canada. I think that you all have received a copy of the amendment. It's on page 27.1. We know that the first part of this issue of eligibility, it will be created through a tax return, but ultimately it will be the CRTC that will determine the eligibility. What we are suggesting is that there should be or added that would specify where it says meeting the general conditions, and in the draft we would add or, and three I's, the three little I's that should be withdrawn in that particular clause, because it is the same subject that we are proposing. And on page, that is to say in clause 31.1 C, they would have that withdrawn. And with B, take away the and, replace it with or in the text. And well, I'll leave it up to the clerk of the committee to deal with all that, but I wanted to submit that to you. And I hope that that will allow us to participate in the legislation itself. Yes, thank you so much, Madame Gisette. With respect to the magazine industry, our coalition represents some 400 editors, west to east in Canada, small and large undertakings as well. As my colleague has said, there will be very much that will affect our industry in terms of this legislation. Our issues are these, and our challenges that we face are very much like periodicals, those faced by the periodicals and newspapers, but we do not have the funding. Magazines play a very important role in Canada in propagating the news ecosystem, and they supply quality information, often supplying a rather unusual take on a newsworthy event. That's what we do in our alliance. And we want to provide complete but nuanced coverage. Also, there's the cultural aspect, because magazines offer a variety of coverage. They can go into depth on events. They reflect our culture, our way of life, what we like and not, and also our concerns. Social justice, women's issues, food security, and so on. And magazines are a very important source of education for Canadians because they are able to affect the overall collectivity of Canada, both on a national and individual basis. Thank you.
Un peu comme d'autres personnes l'ont dit.
We listened to the other witnesses this morning, and we know that there is some concern about the elephant in the room, that is AI. There can be twists in the same way that would affect our identity, our culture, our popular culture. And one last word on that, knowing that we are in a hyper-competitive environment. Two editors we know have used AI to produce a magazine of 136 pages in 2 days. So technology really is out of our control. Thank you. Thank you. Each senator will have 5 minutes to ask questions, and that does include the answer. Senator Méville-Deschênes, thank you very much, Chair.
A first question, it's a short question for you, Mr. Derek Fildebrandt. You said you wanted an opt-in clause. How about, other media have talked to me about this. How about an opt-out clause in Section 27? Because I understand that the CRTC can decide at any point who's in. So would you be satisfied with an opt-out clause for a media like yours? And we've talked before, so I understand your question.
Thank you for the question, Senator. It would be an improvement over the current bill, but my concern is, in my discussions with Meta and Google, that their retaliation is. I really hate that I have to sit here and defend two companies I really don't like, but I'm not here to defend them. They're just the least bad guy in this. But they're going to retaliate for this, as they have a right to do and as I would expect them to do. And they're probably not going to go through a list of the thousands of Alberta publications. I know some of the senators here have Substack pages. Those could very plausibly be considered news to some extent, or at least opinion on news and caught within media, and then blocked on these platforms. And in my discussions with Meta and Google, they're not going to hire a whole team of people to crawl through every little page and say, okay, well, these guys have opted out, these guys are in. They're just going to blanket ban it, which is why if we make the bill opt in, it makes it possible for us to contain this fight between the Goliaths to those who want to have the fight. I don't want to have the fight, and I shouldn't have to enter the ring and say I shouldn't be by default in the ring. I just should not have to walk into it if I don't want to walk into it. I suppose another interesting alternative would be to take the advice of one of the previous witnesses, and I will voluntarily have us labeled as a hate group if that will get us out of this bill.
Okay, thank you for this short answer. Thank you for clarifying that. Je vais m'adresser maintenant à
Now I will turn to the representatives of the magazine industry with a few maybe difficult questions. When you look at the definition of what constitutes news, and I know that it depends to an extent on interpretation, but to include magazines, what does that mean? Does that mean Maclean's, which is an information-based magazine? I don't know what type of research you've done about that, but how can you think that a magazine is like Sept Jours, which just has pictures of the stars in Quebec? It's very popular. It's very much read, but does it contain news? Perhaps, but maybe not. How can you bring those two together? When you speak to magazines in quotation marks, because that you can have a magazine that includes gossip about stars plus hard news. How can that be included? I could perhaps answer partially the question. If you look at other examples of magazines that do journalism and do news as well, it's you always have to confront this type of bias about gossip magazines, but they exist. Yes, they do, but you can't neglect the others because of that particular type of content that is followed up by others. So you say a case-by-case basis? Well, case-by-case, maybe so. Yes, to my mind. But Sept Jours, the magazine you mentioned, you could go into their editorial room to see who's reading the text, who's going over it. Does it meet journalistic standards? But I think that there are people that write those texts. They are general interest text, but I think that those people who are writing it do fall under the description. Well, the second part of my question deals with news. Are they magazines? Yes, there are news magazines. Definitely. So it's not all magazines that would be excluded of the various types. Would some be covered? It's what we think right now is that it would be fewer than 10. Your time is over, Senator.
Protégez-vous, par exemple, Québec Science. Ils sont pas là, alors.
Quebec Science. No, I'm sorry, the time is over. Senator Simons.
Such nice Alberta representation today. I want to start with Mr. Jameson in St. Albert. You've expressed support for C-18, but also pointed out that smaller newspapers like yours and like the ethnic media groups that we heard from earlier this morning may be disadvantaged in comparison to the Goliaths, to use Mr. Fildebrandt's term. You also mentioned a variety of other things that you thought might be more targeted and useful to small publications like yours. We obviously, C-18 doesn't include a fund model, but I can't help but think when I listen to you and when I listen to our previous witnesses from the minority language and ethnic press, that there must surely be a more tactical, surgical way to support small publications rather than forcing them to bargain with Meta and Google.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of debate amongst amongst the industry and different players because I mean, like I said, it's very diverse. We have members that serve all sorts of communities, right? And it's difficult because there's a lot of unknown with C-18. We have some idea of what's happened in Australia, but no one really knows the details of it. This legislation is different. I mean, it's kind of built on a two-way value exchange. And when we look at small communities, say one of our papers out in Barhead, Alberta, that's serving 3,500 people that live in that rural area, you know, what does that value exchange look like? What support is actually going to come from? On the other side, we have existing like members within our association that have existing deals with platforms, but may operate at a different scale than some of our smaller members. So, I mean, there's just great unknown as to what might actually come out of C-18, knowing that there might be other ways of supporting small, low traffic communities.
Monsieur Lapierre,
Mr. Lapierre.
there are a lot of great magazines in this country that combine news and lifestyle. I'm thinking about Toronto Life, Maisonneuve in Montreal, Edify in Edmonton. How has the government provided any information to you about whether or not a magazine like Toronto Life, which combines lifestyle with current affairs, like Maisonneuve, like Edify, how are they going to be classified?
No, okay. We don't have any specific information about this. We have asked Heritage and to see, you know, who they see as eligible, but they're saying that it's going to be the CRTC and that we should be speaking to them, but it's going to be at another step of the, you know, and they're going to look at eligibility. So we want to talk about it now because we think that if we take out the article on 27, you know, the 27, the article number 3 is going to help us to bring in more magazines, as you said, mainly Toronto Life and others that also do current affairs, also popular culture, but serious subjects and all that. Yes.
Mr. Fildebrandt, you were in the room when we heard the last witnesses talking about what they felt to be a need for a code of ethics. As you well know, because back when I was a journalist and you were a politician, we've changed roles here. It's really important that the press be free to report without fear or favor. And I realize I'm putting you in an awkward position since you have stated very plainly here that you do not wish the help of C-18. But what challenges do you perceive in your new role as journalist with the idea of the CRTC deciding who's legitimate and who is not?
Thank you, Senator. We already have so-called Canadian Qualified Journalism Organization status. I applied for it as a joke, just to see what would happen. I had no intention of accepting the subsidies, but we did get it. And the kind lady from CRTC asked me if I would like any help in now filling out the forms for the different subsidies. And I just said, no, it was all a gag. And I thank the CRTC for it. But there are challenges.
It's the CRA, right?
Sorry, I meant CRA,
CRA,
not
yeah.
CRTC. Yeah, forgive me. There are challenges. Advertising
I
is
hate
tough.
to cut you off, Mr. Fildebrandt, but I have the unenviable task of being the gatekeeper today.
Cut off press and former politicians.
So freedom has its limits in the Senate. Senator Cormier, followed by Senator Cardozo.
Merci, merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question is for Madame Ducette and Monsieur Lapierre. Clearly, according to the current bill, how many of your magazines members would be eligible? And if changes to C-18 would be accepted, how many would be eligible? Figures, please. We can come back to you with figures, but presently I can say that it would be the majority with the changes that we are proposing would be eligible. 3 on the question of exclusion for specific types of magazines. You want to see that removed from the bill. Can you explain why briefly? Because I think that the press in general that covers these subjects, and what magazines do is target certain subjects. So, but they are working towards the same end. When you look at a newspaper or when you look at a magazine, and the magazine may reference a lifestyle as well as news. So it's difficult to see the place that magazines would hold within this type of legislation. It would have to be more specific. Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Hildebrandt. You explained your funding model, as I have just said, how do you assess that? How do you assess the revenues that you get in terms of advertisement, and how much do you get from subscriptions?
I want to know exactly how do you evaluate the amount of money you get from publicities, from and how from the les abonnements? How do you say abonnements? Subscriptions.
We receive our revenue is split. It varies month to month, but on average, we're roughly 50% subscriptions, 50% advertising. It's fluctuated over time. It's taken us a long time to build up our capacity to sell advertising. I mean, I'm not entirely without sympathy for media that have talked about the collapse of the advertising model. Google has come in, like when we first started the Western Standard, we tried building Google ads, that auto-populate from Google in, and they just paid pennies on the dollar. It wasn't worth it, just made the website look ugly and gave virtually no money. So we took them out. But we had to painstakingly over a few years build our ability to directly sell ads to customers. And that's very difficult work. I hate it. It's really hard to find people who are good at that. But it is necessary to do for the media if they want to have any advertising side of it. But conversely, we absolutely need subscriptions. That's roughly 50% of our revenue. We refer to as memberships, but it's same thing, subscriptions. And it's like not to make this a commercial, but it's $10 a month. And we have a limited paywall mechanism in place so that we're able to, between those two sources, fund our operations.
Donc, selon ce que je vois là sur les publicités.
Okay, so what I see from the advertising income that you get, you have reached independence, even if United Conservatives take out ads. You are nonetheless journalistically independent. You're not affected by that ad that is on your site.
They're willing to pay our posted rate. We've offered to sell ads to the Alberta New Democratic Party, other smaller political parties. We have private businesses that advertise, not-for-profit organizations. Now, the independents, Senator Simons, others here who have been around the business know that you have to do your very best to try and have a firewall in place between your advertisers and your newsrooms. And most journalists will also know, especially, particularly in smaller publications where it's not hundreds of people in a building where you can physically separate each other. Back in the 90s, maybe the advertising department would never meet the news department. But you have to try your very best to have a firewall in place. But it is impossible to 100% separate it. Any publisher who tells you otherwise is probably lying, which is one reason that direct government funding of the media is so dangerous. And now the proposal in C-18 to bring in tech giants funding the media is dangerous, because then we'll have these, no one advertiser for us makes up a critical portion of our revenue, but the government is making up 33% now.
I don't want you to be cut by the chair. So
Yeah.
I want to thank you for your answer.
Merci
Westminster.
merci pour ton.
Thank you very much for being so kind, Senator Cormier. Senator Cardoza, thank you, Chair.
Take a step back and just ask you a general question. Certainly, Mr. Fildebrandt has made the case for the bill not going into effect, and I'd like to get Mr. Jameson your thoughts about what the future of your media is in this world of online media and artificial intelligence. Madame Doucette, quel est l'avenir de votre média dans...
Well, how do you see the future of your media in terms of AI and its use? I'll begin with Mr. Jameson, please.
Like, just give a larger picture of what's happening if this bill doesn't go into effect.
Well, I think we'll just see continued decline and continued loss of papers in many of our communities. I think there's a lot of operations that are running on the ragged edge as it is, and we will just continue to see that decline in advertising, the increasing cost of production in the physical world of putting out newspapers, and more closures without more intervention. Just because I think we need to bear in mind that when we look at a lot of our membership, we're secondary or tertiary sources of news in the world. People are looking at the Globe and Mail or the New York Times for that very high level, national, international coverage. And then you get into kind of the provincial side of things. And then you get down to your local community, and we're all fighting for attention, people's limited attention spans. And it makes it especially difficult as you start serving smaller and smaller communities. As far as AI, I think it's really difficult to understand how that's going to affect us, other than the proliferation of content and the difficulties it's going to cause in reporting and sussing out what is true and what isn't true, especially when you get into generative AI video and whatnot. It's just going to make reporting ever more difficult, and it's just going to create ever more content for people to have to sift through.
Make of the dinosaur argument that I don't mean to be rude, but some will say you're dinosaurs and we should just let you go.
Well, but I think this is where people need to spend time and actually look at what people are doing. Many of our members have digital agencies, digital operations. They run in both worlds, much like many successful models that we might see with the Globe and Mail. They still print papers, although they're very successful on the digital side. It's a matter of serving your readers wherever they are. If we thought we could get away with just digital, I wouldn't go through the headache of having to print and distribute newspapers every day. It's a major challenge and major expense. But in the digital world, it's very difficult to attain enough advertising revenue, especially in smaller markets. The much going back to how C-18 is going to fund small publishers, we are not high traffic. When we're writing about what's happening in the town of Bonnyville, Alberta, it's generally only the people in Bonnyville, Alberta who are interested in that, but it's very important information to those people in that community. We're not trying to reach the broad Canadian audience.
I'm just going to cut you off before the chair does. Madame Doucette.
I think we share the same opinions. What will be true and what will not be true. What is of concern to me particularly, I could see that in the Canadian press, La Presse Canadienne, there are scholarships. It's almost as if it has infiltrated Canadian press. There are CRTC bursaries that are being offered. And I think that magazines, though, will continue to exist, but we are in a time of change in terms of just paper or not. All Canadian citizens are not really comfortable with the digital world. So they turn to paper still. I just want to add this. The dinosaur model does operate, and people think it doesn't. But there are models, dinosaur models, that tried to move towards a digital model, but weren't able to do so successfully. So you have a two-speed type of model. So you have one that is digitized and one that is hard copy, paper. So it is difficult to juggle those two models. But to come back to artificial intelligence that you brought up, it is coming on so fast that it's scary. As I mentioned, there are magazines. I spoke to a magazine that was created in 5 days, 136-page long magazine. And so people aren't being hired. It's because AI can do it faster. And that is actually happening now. When we talk about time lost, it's just too late. It's already too late. It's the matter of speed, the speed of technology, and that is making our publishers afraid. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Chair. And my question is to Mr. Jameson as well. But before I ask my question, the previous panel and you and your commentary expressed concern that the small ethnic or small rural newspapers and media may be disadvantaged in a program such as the one we're discussing. I just want to put on the record that in Australia, which is the basis of this, although it's somewhat adjusted, in Australia, there are large organizations that did not succeed in reaching agreements, and the small organizations that did. And if you look at the highest per journalist payment, it was to the Australian Country Press Australia, which has 180 rural newspapers and publications that gained the largest proportion of subsidy from per journalist. Just on the record, I think it's important for us not to look at just the big numbers, but what are the implications of the process that hopefully we'll be able to put in place. But my question, Mr. Jameson, is the following. Could you describe in a little more detail than you did to my colleague, Senator Cardoso, the drop in revenue that you've experienced? And you've expressed concern for the time that it'll take to implement this regime should Parliament pass it. I would like to have a bit of commentary from you as to what the pace of decline is and how we could shorten the introduction of these measures, even if we don't manage them as a Senate individually. We can collectively underscore to the government the importance of moving faster than inertia. Mr. Jameson.
Yeah, I don't have the exact numbers sitting in front of me at the moment, but we could gather looking at that. But I mean, this has been a rate of decline over many years. I mean, more than a decade. You know, we've seen the, online classifieds probably being one of the first things that were really hit, and so on and so forth as things have gone over the years. So we've seen an industry that's been decimated over a very long period of time, and one that's been grappling and adjusting to over time, and one that's been experimenting with new advertising models and different ways of doing things. And we've seen a lot of members disappear. I mean, Dennis might be able to give us an exact number, but our association used to have over 120 members. Now we're just over 90. Some of that through, aggregation of small towns into regional titles, and some from just things disappearing over time. And with the Australian side, I mean, no one really knows. I mean, I think this is the big problem. There's great uncertainty what this means to small publishers, because from what we know about offers that have been, and deals that have been made already, and offers that have been made, is generally built around traffic. The online platforms generally work around traffic, selling ads against many eyeballs, and small newspaper sites don't drive a lot of traffic. They're generally driving. It's like I was saying before. It's just of what's interest to the local community. We serve local communities. We're not trying to reach very broad audiences across Canada or even the province. So it's just great uncertainty as to what this actually means. But when we look at some of the forecasts that have been done for Canada, because the legislation's a bit different, and I believe that the platforms are probably going to treat this a bit differently as they look at their exposure across many different jurisdictions. It's not just Canada and Australia looking at this, it's California, it's many, many other countries around the world that these platforms are either going to, as Mr. Fildebrandt said, and has been indicated in it by their own witness testimony, that they're going to walk away from news, but also that they're going to try to drive much harder bargains because they're looking at how much this is going to cost them across the world. As this type of legislation rolls out, it becomes extremely expensive, and we just don't know how that's going to affect us and how much different deals we are able, the deals we're able to achieve might be quite a bit different than what's been seen in Australia.
Mr. Merrill?
Yes, just to put some numbers to the question from Mr. Harder. The decline, as Evan mentioned, has been slow and steady over 10, 12 years. Like, as an example, our association has been involved in what we describe as national advertising that we place in the newspapers. And in 2010 to 12, it would have been in the $14 million a year annual range, annually. Today, it's maybe 1 to 2 million. So in terms of that form of advertising, the decline has been probably 70, 80%. Locally, what I hear from publishers is that it's probably more like 30 to 50%, but they're still operating on far, far less today than they were even a few short years ago. So it's pretty dire, as Evan has pointed out.
Senator Dasco, followed by Senator Clement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is for Madame Doucette and Monsieur Lapierre. Just a point of clarifications. Are you asking for all magazines to be covered in this bill, or just for some? And if it is just for some, which ones? If you could just describe that, because I'm not exactly clear.
We have how it's proposed, the law, how it's proposed, but we know that for the first criteria, when we talk about, lorsqu'on parle d'impôt, je vais vous parler en français.
Yeah, I'm going to speak in French. It's easier for me. When we talk about taxes, it's quite easy to get to the list of eligible businesses. We think they are fewer than 10. I can't give you all the information because some information is confidential, but it's fewer than 10, I would say. But if you could add clause 3, in clause 3, add magazines.
Okay.
Okay, just describe. Rather than talking about clauses, do you want all magazines or just some? And just if you could just describe which ones.
Okay, I gave
which type, just which type.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, I spoke about Protégez-vous. Protégez-vous, for example, is a magazine that talks about consumers' affairs, what kind of laundry machine you should buy or whatever. So it's really a consumer affairs magazine. It doesn't deal with opinions. It really deals with facts and logic. I talked about Québec Science because it is one of the magazines that is really important for young people and for, to get people interested in science. Maybe you have other examples.
We do have other examples, but I think your question, if I can say, is, if I can try to answer it, is right now there's a minority, less than a minority of our members that would be eligible, if eligible. And now, like I said to Senator Cormier, it would be the majority. I don't think we want to include every single one magazines that we represent, but if we can get more involved, I think it helps the industry, and I think it definitely helps our members.
You're going well beyond news, well beyond news. Is that correct? In terms of what you're looking for, because this is supposed to help news operations. So you're saying any type, like any type of interest, just in general
Correct. Well,
terms.
again, it goes down to definition of news and general interest content. That's where we stand when we go in depth in a subject. That's our speciality with magazines. And, you know, we do cover news, though minority of our membership do cover news on a day-to-day basis, but they still do it. And as of right now, I don't think they would be eligible. So
But you think they should be. So,
yes.
so let's just say Chatelaine magazine. I remember. I mean, they have some news in there, but it's almost probably 90% lifestyle. Would they? Do you feel they should be magazines?
But
like that should be
newspaper has
covered?
different categories of content in them, right? You get sports in newspaper.
So essentially, you're looking to cover almost all magazines. Because there's a lot of magazines in this country.
Correct.
Yeah.
We're saying at the present time that there is more opacity than we think there is between magazine and news, and that we're doing more and more the same thing in a different way. And so we're saying that the law as it is proposed is too narrow to include
Yes,
some
no,
magazines that could be important.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't have the list of the 400 or less that would be eligible, but we think that if we're really talking about eligibility now, and it's just going to, it's another step. It's going to be
Yes,
after.
I understand.
that
Sir,
we
if you don't
don't-
mind,
we
like
won't have
something
any-
like, excuse me, like a mechanics
Senator
magazine. Would
Dasco,
that be
time
included?
is up, unfortunately. I wish we had more time with this panel. Sénatrice Clément, vous avez la parole.
For being here. Full disclosure, I love dinosaurs and pterodactyls, and I was a paper girl. I was a paper girl decades ago. I delivered the Montreal Star. So yes, my question is for the Coalition of Magazines. So in a small market like in my home community of Cornwall, Ontario, we have a couple of magazines like Cornwall Living, like Perch Magazine, Blend of News, Blend of Lifestyle. Very limited editions. So they will sit in restaurants and in newsstands for the whole year. People love them, and they sit in their homes and they go in depth into local issues. I guess my question is, Meta was here last week saying that they would cut off, links to news. How does that impact your industry? Like, your industry is very important to local communities. Does what Meta has said affect you? Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I read what Meta said, a bit of a thread. Absolutely. We mainly because all of the publishers do, they use those platforms, and some of those contents appear on those platforms without even the publishers posting them, right? So I guess a short answer would be yes, absolutely. It will affect them. To what capacity is to be defined, but it will definitely hurt the overall industry.
Avez-vous quelque chose à ajouter?
Non, mais
Do you have something to add? No. I think that the giants, the web giants, shouldn't be managing our news, nor our magazines, or our local news, our local coverage, even as compared with national coverage. We support what is there.
I guess the question I have with the couple of minutes that are left has to do with CBC, which of course gets over $1 billion a year in government funding, and simultaneously they compete in the same marketplace that your magazines and your local newspapers are competing for advertising dollar. And now we have a bill which we are going to be giving them additional funding from digital giants in order to continue to compete. And of course, I'd like to know what your views are on that. Go ahead.
This is sort of a follow-up to the question I didn't get to complete from Senator Simons about what are the challenges we're facing. The biggest challenge by far we face at the Western Standard, at least, is that our competitors are subsidized with our own tax dollars. We are a relatively small company paying taxes to Ottawa that are then redistributed to our competitors. So, for instance, CBC, I'm not going to get into whatever anyone thinks about them, but they're clearly a competitor. And while they're technically a broadcaster, the distinctions between what is a broadcaster, a magazine, a newspaper, they're irrelevant today. I fought with the Workers' Compensation Board about if the Western Standard was a magazine or a newspaper. Well, we're kind of neither. We used to be a magazine at one point, but we had to fight over it because that determined what our premiums were. They're all the same thing. We're all online. Some have a physical manifestation with a CRTC license. Some might have a physical print product, but you can't tell the difference with them anymore. So the CBC is not just competing with CTV and Global. They're competing with the Edmonton Journal, the Western Standard, the Toronto Star. But then Post Media, the Heralds, the Journals, the Suns, they're competing with us as well. And they're doing so with our tax dollars against us. C-18 wouldn't necessarily be our tax dollars against us, but still giving a leg up to our competitors over us. Theoretically, if the money is actually there, I'm very skeptical that the money will actually be there and just that we're going to be collateral damage in their fight between them. But if there really is anything that Ottawa can do to help independent publishers, the innovative ones, the guys who are selling light bulbs, not candles, is to stop funding the candle industry. Stop trying to advantage our competitors over us with our own tax dollars and let nature, let the market sort it out.
Anyone else?
I'm not here to open a debate here, but his competitors he's talking about, some of them are my members, and they're barely keeping their head above water. I think it's crucial for democracy to have many voices, not just one. So to me, it's crucial to have help, to have as many voices as possible, and that's through some funding.
My question is about concentrating so much capital into one voice. How do you help all the other voices?
I sincerely think that Radio-Canada, CBC are both very important for democracy, and that voice is going to remain essential for many, many people, for facts, to speak to them.
You want to weigh in? No? So I'd like to thank our panelists all for being here. Merci beaucoup pour votre présence aujourd'hui.
Thank you for being here today.
We went over our allocated time, so I thank everyone for their cooperation. So with that, I adjourn this meeting.